In October of 1979, Noreen Castile, a 52-year-old widow in Chelan County, Washington, backed her dented pickup up to the coal pile behind the packing house and began loading the bruised, hail-marked apples that the whole valley called garbage, fruit the packer paid a hauler to carry away. The men at the co-op cafe named her the Vinegar Woman, and they laughed about it for 2 full seasons, right up until the pencil ledger she kept at her kitchen table crossed 6 figures, and the same packing house sent a man to her dock, hat in his hands, asking to sign a standing contract for the very culls it had once paid to dump. She had not gone strange in the head. She had read a thing in a dead woman's oilcloth notebook that not one of those men had the patience to read. She was a lean, weather-cured woman with a graying braid she pinned up under a feed store cap, shoulders squared off by 40 years on an orchard ladder, and she wore her late husband's flannel work shirts with the cuffs turned twice because she could not bring herself to cut them down. Her hands were large-knuckled and stained at the nail beds with the brown of crushed fruit. She walked like a person who has counted every step of her own ground, unhurried, certain, a little bolligate from the cold cellar floors. When she drove slow, 40 miles an hour on the valley road, 10 under the posted limit. And she let the young men in their trucks blow past her and lay on the horn, and she did not once look over. Everyone in that valley knew what culls were. Culls were the apples that came off the grading line rejected, the hail-pocked and the bruised and the wind-scarred and the small, the fruit no grocer would stack in a pyramid. The packing house ran them down a chute into a heap out back, and twice a week a flatbed carried the heap to the county pit, and the packer paid the hauler by the ton to make the garbage go away. That was orthodoxy. A cull was a loss you swallowed, and any grocery in Wenatchee would sell you a whole gallon of distilled white vinegar for 89 cents. So a sane woman did not haul rotting fruit up a grade to make a thing the store already sold for the price of a loaf of bread. When Noreen Castile asked the packer's yard boss if she could take the culls off his hands for free, he thought it was a joke. "You want the garbage," he said. "The bruised, the hail hit, all of it you'll give me," she said. "For what, Noreen?" "What in the world does a person do with a truckload of rot?" "Vinegar," she said, and did not explain further, and he laughed and shook his head and thought she had lost her husband and her sense in the same bad year, and he waved her toward the pile and told the men not to charge her for the gas it took to load. What the men at that cafe did not know was that the answer was already written down in pencil, in a hand that had been in the ground since 1961, on the ruled pages of a notebook bound in cracked black oilcloth. The notebook had belonged to her mother. It had been kept through the worst of the Depression, when a bruised apple was not garbage, but supper, and when nothing that grew was ever allowed to rot if a person could turn it into something that kept. Her mother had made cider vinegar the slow way, the old way, as the old country people made it before a factory ever bottled the stuff. You pressed the fruit for its sweet juice. You let the wild yeast take the sugar down to hard cider in a warm, dark room. And then you let a second, slower life take the cider down to vinegar, over long months in oak, guarded by a living thing the old women called the mother, a pale, trembling raft of living culture that floated on the top and passed the work from one barrel to the next, year upon year, like a candle lit from a candle. Noreen Castile had that mother still. It lived in a stone crock in her cellar, and it had been alive and working since 1934, 45 years unbroken, fed and split and carried down through one kitchen after another. Her own mother had carried it wrapped in a wet cloth on the back of a wagon. The notebook told her, in fragments she had read so many times she knew them cold better than she knew the Lord's Prayer, that the culls the valley threw away were the finest thing a person could ask for. Bruised fruit, her mother had written, is fruit that has already begun. A sound apple fights you. A bruised apple is halfway home. So that was the secret the cafe never guessed. The vinegar woman was not making garbage into garbage. She was making garbage into the one thing the modern valley had forgotten how to make. The work itself was brutal and slow and entirely without glamour, and she did nearly all of it alone. Through that first autumn, she hauled load after load of culls up the grade and tipped them into a wooden bin by the cellar door. She washed them in a galvanized stock tank, culling the culls, throwing the truly rotten to the hogs, keeping the merely bruised. She fed them a bushel at a time into a hand-crank grinder her husband had built from a cast-iron flywheel and a hopper. And the ground pomace went in cloth-wrapped layers into an old rack and cloth press, a press her father-in-law had used before the First War. She threw her whole body onto the press screw and turned it a quarter turn at a time, and the sweet cloudy juice ran down the oak racks into a bucket, and her arms shook, and she did it again and again until her hands would not close. The juice went into barrels. She had bought 11 oak barrels at a farm sale for $2 apiece, whiskey barrels with the char still in them, and she scalded them and filled them and set them in a row in the fruit cellar where the temperature held near 60 degrees the year round. She spread a clean sheet of the living mother across the top of the first barrel. Then she waited. Fermentation is not a thing a person can hurry. The cider had to go dry and hard first, bubbling under a loose cloth for weeks, and only then did the slow second life begin, the mother thickening and spreading and turning the alcohol to acid a breath at a time. She racked the barrels, drawing the clearing vinegar off its sediment into fresh oak. She skimmed. She topped. She tasted with a wooden spoon and wrote the number in the ledger. 6 months, her mother's notebook said. Do not rush her. She will tell you when. She learned the smell of a barrel gone right, sharp and clean and faintly sweet under the bite, and the smell of one gone wrong, flat and dead. And she poured the wrong ones out on the ground without regret and started them over. The cellar was cold work through the long orchard country winters, and she did it in her husband's flannel and a pair of wool socks inside her boots, and some nights she carried a kerosene lamp down the stairs and sat among the barrels a long while, listening to them breathe, and thought about the woman who had taught her mother and the woman who had taught that woman. A line of patient hands running back further than the ledger could name. On Saturdays, she set up a card table at the growers' market in town with a hand-lettered sign and a row of quart jars, and she sold raw cider vinegar for $1.25 a jar, and mostly she sold nothing at all. The men from the cafe would come by on their way to the feed store and stand with their coffee and grin. "How's the garbage business?" one of them said, a heavy, red-faced grower named Orrin Petty who farmed the block that bordered hers on the south. He said it every single Saturday. It was the closest thing he had to wit. Slow, she would answer, and nothing more, and count her jars. "You know they sell that stuff at the store for near nothing," another grower offered one morning, not unkindly. "Whole gallon, under $1. "That's not this," she said. "Vinegar's vinegar, Noreen." "No," she said, "it isn't." And that was the longest she ever argued it, and she went back to her jars, and the men drifted off toward the feed store, still grinning, and told the story again over their coffee about the widow up the grade who hauled rot for a living. Orrin Petty was not merely a mocker. He was patient, and he was hungry, and what he was hungry for was her ground. Her orchard block ran down to good water and sat square against his own, and he had made her 3 offers since the funeral, each one lower than the last, each one dressed up as a kindness to a widow who surely could not go on alone. He kept a folded offer sheet in his truck. He was waiting, patient as a coyote at the edge of the light, for the winter that would make her sign. His wife, a quiet woman named Ada, watched all of this from the truck and said nothing, until one evening, driving home, she said his name once, just the once, Orrin. That was all. He did not answer her, and he did not stop grinning at the market, but he heard it, and it sat in him. The vindication was not close yet. First came the winter that nearly took it all. In the late winter of 1981, the county sanitarian drove out to her place. He was a young man with a clipboard and a new set of state regulations, and he had received a complaint, though he would not say from whom, and he walked her cellar looking at 11 open oak barrels with pale living rafts floating on top, and his face closed like a door. He wrote that the operation was insanitary. He wrote that raw. Unpasteurized product, fermented in open wooden vessels in a dirt-floored cellar, could not be sold for human consumption under the new code. He wrote the word unfit. And a copy of that report on county letterhead went up on the corkboard at the co-op where every grower in the valley bought his spray and his baler twine and read his mail, tacked right beside the auction notices, for all of them to see and cluck over. That was the lowest she ever came. For 3 days she did not go to the cellar. Orrin Petty drove over on the 4th day with the folded offer sheet smoothed flat on the seat beside him, and he was gentle about it, almost tender. "There's no shame in it, Noreen," he said, standing in her kitchen with his cap in his hand. "A woman your age has earned her rest. The county's already said what it thinks. Let me take the block off your hands and you keep the house and a little money besides. It's a fair price, fairer than you'll get come spring. You've wanted this ground since before he passed," she said. "I've wanted to see you looked after," he said. And she knew that for the half-truth it was, and she said nothing. He put the paper on her kitchen table next to the oilcloth notebook and set a pen on top of it and said he would come back in a week. She sat at that table a long time after his truck was gone. She opened the notebook to the last page her mother had written, the page she had read 1,000 times, and under her mother's pencil she read the line that was not advice about vinegar at all. "Let no man's fear price what your own hands have proved." She did not sign the paper. She turned it face down. And instead of quitting, she did the one thing the young sanitarian's report had not thought to fear. She drew a quart of her clearest vinegar off the No. 4 barrel, and she packed it in a wooden box with straw, and she drove it herself 40 miles an hour to an independent testing laboratory in Wenatchee, and paid $18 she did not have to spare to have it measured against the law and against the national brand. She waited 11 days for the letter. When it came, she read it standing at the mailbox. The lab certificate said that her raw cider vinegar carried an acidity of 5 4/10%. Well above the 4% the law required to call a thing vinegar at all, and higher than the leading bottled brand they had tested beside it. It said the product was clean, that it carried no harmful organism, that the living mother was not a contaminant, but the agent of the acid itself. It said in the flat language of a chemist. That the garbage in her cellar was better vinegar than the money could buy in any store in the state. She took that certificate to the county, and the sanitarian, to his credit, read it twice and signed her a permit, and the report came down off the co-op board. But by then, the thing that would change her life had already begun to move. 300 miles to the west, and it had nothing to do with the county at all. The early 1980s were the first years of the health food boom, and out in Seattle the shelves of a new kind of store were filling with brown glass and hand-inked labels, and the word had gotten around among those buyers that raw, unfiltered, mother of vinegar cider vinegar, the old kind, the living kind, was the very thing their customers were driving across the city to find. A distributor's buyer had tasted her quart at a regional food show where the extension office had, almost as a lark, set her card table among the jams. He wrote her a letter. In the spring of 1982, he placed an order for 200 cases. She read the number 3 times. 200 cases was 2,400 quarts. It was more vinegar than she had ever made in a year. Here is where the ledger begins to climb, and it climbs in numbers, because numbers are the only honest way to tell this part. She filled the first 200 cases from the barrels she had, and she borrowed against the orchard to buy 40 more oak barrels and a proper crank press, and she hired the 2 Ruiz brothers from down the valley to turn the screw so her hands could keep the books. The 200 cases sold through in 5 weeks. The distributor came back and asked for 400. By the autumn of 1982, her raw cider vinegar was on the shelf in 40 stores from Bellingham down to Portland, and every one of those stores reordered. The arithmetic of it was the thing the cafe men could never have imagined, and it ran like this. The packing house dumped near 40 tons of culls behind its line in a season, and it had been paying $2 a ton to be rid of them, so the fruit at the heart of the whole enterprise cost her nothing but the diesel and the labor to haul it. 40 tons of sound culls pressed down to something near 5,000 gallons of raw cider vinegar in a good year. 5,000 gallons was 20,000 quarts, and 20,000 quarts was better than 1,600 cases, and the distributor took them at a wholesale case price, that when she sat at the kitchen table with the stub of her pencil and walked it down the page line by line, the fruit at nothing, the barrels amortized, the Ruiz brothers paid. The labels and the freight and the $18 lab test she now ran on every batch came out, in the year 1984, above $100,000. 6 figures, from the pile the valley paid to throw away. She did not celebrate it loudly. She wrote the figure in the ledger, underlined it once, and made a pot of coffee, and went down to the cellar to skim the barrels, because the barrels did not care what the number was. By 1985, a regional grocery chain had put her vinegar in 90 of its stores, and a national mail-order catalog of natural goods carried it, and she had 4 people working the press and the line and a proper bottling room with a concrete floor the sanitarian himself came out to bless. And that was the autumn the reckoning came, the way it always comes in this valley, quietly and from an unexpected direction. The packing house had a new field man that year, a young fellow named Everett, and it was Everett who was sent to figure out why the culls, which the company had thrown away for 40 years, were suddenly worth something to a woman up the grade. He came to her dock on a gray morning while she was checking a pallet, and he stood turning his cap in his hands, and he would not quite meet her eye. "Ma'am," he said, "the company wants to talk to you about the culls, about selling them to you instead of hauling them off." He hesitated. "My father didn't send me. He doesn't know I'm here. I read your lab report, the one they posted at the co-op. I kept a copy of it." He looked up then. "I wanted to learn how you did it." She looked at that young man a long moment, and she did not gloat, because there was no gloating in her, and because the notebook had a line about that too. She wiped her hands on her apron and she said, "Come in out of the cold. Then I'll show you the mother." The apology came separately, and it came from Orrin Petty, and it cost him more to give than the offer sheet had ever cost her to refuse. He caught her at the market on a Saturday in the spring, and he stood at her card table where he had stood grinning for 2 seasons, and he took off his cap, and his red face was redder than usual. "I was wrong about you, Noreen," he said. "I was wrong for the better part of 3 years. I told everybody in that cafe you'd gone soft, and you were the only one of us making money off a bad crop." He turned the cap in his hands the way the young man had. "I'd take it back if I could." "You just did," she said, and poured him a quart to take home to Ada and would not let him pay for it. The county extension office wrote her up that same year in its bulletin on value-added agriculture, a mimeographed pamphlet that went out to every grower from the Cascades to the Idaho line, and they set her operation in it as the case study, the model, the thing to copy. They quoted her acidity number. They printed the arithmetic of the culls. And near the bottom of the second page, in the flat gray type of a government form, they wrote the sentence she cut out and kept in the front of the oilcloth notebook for the rest of her days. The method is not new. It is recorded in the private notebook of the operator's mother, kept in Chelan County since the 1930s. Her mother's name went into that bulletin, typed and permanent 40 years after the woman had made her last barrel and gone into the ground with nobody but her daughter thinking her wisdom worth a thing. And the packing house signed the contract. It signed a standing agreement to truck its culls, every ton of them, up the grade to Noreen Castile's dock, and to pay her nothing and charge her nothing, and to consider the arrangement a service she did the company by taking its problem away. The men at the co-op cafe watched the packers' own flatbeds carrying the garbage the wrong direction up the valley road toward the Vinegar woman's place, and they did not laugh anymore. There is one of these stories in every county in America if a person only knows to look for it. She ran that company for another 11 years, and she never once moved it off the home place, and she never took the mother out of the stone crock it had lived in since 1934, when her own hands finally could not turn the screw or climb the cellar stairs. She did the thing the old women had always done. She divided the mother. She drew off pale living rafts of it into fresh crocks, one for each of the 2 Ruiz brothers who had turned her press when nobody else would, and one for the extension office to keep, and one for a young woman 2 valleys over who had written her a letter asking how a person starts. She wrote out the method in her own hand in the back of her mother's notebook so the 2 lives, the pencil and the culture, went forward together. And the last thing she is known to have written on the ruled page, under her mother's line and her own long column of figures, was not a number at all. It was 3 words. She kept her. The ledger is in a county museum now, open to that page. The culls still come up the grade. Somewhere in that valley, the mother is still working, still passing the acid from one barrel to the next, a candle lit from a candle, doing the slow, patient thing that not one man at that cafe ever had the patience to learn.